Brand new book. It literally just came out, and we're so excited to have him here because Gregg Jarrett's book. Let me see if I can just manage to get my friend. I think you're up, Greg. What do you know? Okay, this technology thing. It's finally coming around for me. It's good to see you. You have it. We talked about recently a little bit about this book. I started reading it the other night, and I loved it, and I was impressed by it because it's part of our history, and it shows you, I think, in so many ways what a great country we have, and what a great system we can have, and how it often is not so good. The book by Gregg Jarrett, now just released, is called Trial of the Century, and it looks at this high school teacher who dared. So what was it, in the 1920s? He dared to actually teach evolution, and that was not allowed, right, Greg?
No, in fact, you go back almost 100 years ago, there was this deep religious fervor that swept the nation. And the Christian fundamentalist movement became all powerful and led by the great statesman, William Jennings Bryan. And they managed to pass laws in most states that were banning books on science, particularly evolution. They viewed it as a threat to the Bible, the story of man's divine creation. And it didn't conflict. In fact, they're harmonious and they're complementary. And in Tennessee, they took it a step further. And, Trish, they made it a crime for a school teacher to teach evolutionary theory straight out of a state-approved textbook. So it was okay for students to read about it in the textbook, but a teacher dare not mention it. And promptly within days, a young school teacher, 25-year-old John Scopes, was arrested and criminally charged. And the finest trial lawyer who ever lived, Clarence Darrow, who has always been my idol since I was a teenager, and read a book about it.
That's very interesting. You wanted to be a lawyer back then, I guess.
Oh, yeah. I plucked a volume off my father's bookshelf, and it was a bio on Clarence Darrow. And the more I read, the more I admired his commitment to civil liberties, his passion for the law, his sense of justice, and, his principles became mine. They animated my own sense of values. And so Darrow is sitting there in Chicago in his fancy law office, and he is utterly incensed that William Jennings Bryan has done this. He has not only helped pass these laws, he has joined the prosecution team to convict Scopes. Darrow immediately steps in and volunteers for free to defend Scopes. So this sets up a titanic clash of two epic figures in American history in a tiny little town of Dayton, Tennessee. And I went there a couple of years ago, and I dug through the archives, and I found the original trial transcript upon which my book, Trial of the Century, is based.
It's such a neat thing, and it's so relevant today, right? Because we're dealing with similar issues in different ways, of course. We're talking with Gregg Jarrett. It's just out, Trial of the Century. You can buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, probably on your website as well. Trial of the Century, Gregg Jarrett's new book. You have this tremendous legal background, and you are a journalist as well. You approach it often with this legal construct. How is it that you came to this particular, you mentioned that you like Darrow, but did you know about this case before you decided to research it? Which, by the way, all the reviews compliment your tremendous research and highlight just how well done and well researched this book really is. How did you know about it?
Well, as I say, I plucked this book off my dad's shelf, and it was written in 1941, actually. By the wonderful writer that had written, Lust for Life and Agony and the Ecstasy. And he wrote this biography, but at the end of the book, he talks about the Scopes trial. And I always felt like it needed more attention. Mm-hmm. And I decided, somewhere along the line that maybe one day I might write about this book. What I found so interesting is that most people, anybody under 50, has never heard about the Scopes monkey trial, as the media dubbed it, a popular misconception about evolution. This became the legal blockbuster of a generation. Journalists the world over converged on this tiny town. They had microphones set up in the courtroom. It was the first trial broadcast live to a riveted nationwide radio audience, newsreel cameras in the back of the courtroom. And at the end of the day, they would be shuttled off to a waiting plane, fly it to Chicago, distribution in movie houses everywhere, banner headlines in all the major newspapers across America. And the town itself turned into this sort of carnival-like atmosphere. But the climactic moment, Darrow knows he's losing. The jury is stacked. The judge hates him, ruling against him, won't let him put on a defense. He calls to the witness stand his nemesis, the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, as an expert on the Bible. And the judge says, "You can't do that. You can't call the prosecutor." Bryan stands up in all his bluster and bravado, and he says, "Your Honor, I volunteer to take the witness stand. I have nothing to hide. I'd love to tell everybody how everything in the Bible should be taken literally." The judge at this point adjourns the courtroom. He's fearful that the crowd will collapse the second floor courtroom. And people are passing out, stifling heat in the middle of the summer, 1925 in Tennessee. So there happened to be a stage outdoors left over from July 4th activity. I show a picture of Darrow and Bryan face to face with a throng of thousands watching as Darrow cross-examines Bryan and utterly dismantles him and destroyed him. The crowd that came there and adored Bryan began laughing at him and mocking him. By the time it was over, William Jennings Bryan was a broken man. A couple of days later, he laid down for a nap just down the street from the courthouse, and he never woke up. We've got a picture in the book of the casket being loaded onto a Pullman car being taken up to Arlington National Cemetery up in the Washington area. And, it's an incredible story, but it fundamentally changed free speech rights in America. Free speech was...
Walk me through that, because, obviously you didn't have the freedom to teach. It's bizarre to me that they would have it in the textbook, but not allow the teacher to teach it. And, you have to put yourself in the mindset. Look, I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire in the 70s, and I went to a little Catholic school, and I remember learning all about Adam and Eve, and my mom, when school was done, would also teach me about evolution. But they didn't teach that in Catholic school, but you knew what you were signing up for, right? It was a private school, Catholic school. In the case of the state school in Tennessee, they had it in the textbook, but you weren't allowed to teach it. Walk me through that.
Go figure. It's a state-approved textbook of the same legislature that then later voted to criminalize the teaching of that which is in the textbook. And sort of the reasoning was, well, students can read about it, but a teacher can't teach it. So in other words, John Scopes gets arrested for doing his job. I mean, it was outrageous.
Was it at all intentional? I mean, he was a substitute teacher. Did he anticipate this in any way?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, that's sort of the backstory. It's funny you point your finger at that part of it because it's an interesting part. So the town of Dayton, Tennessee had been devastated economically when the coal mines closed down. And once this law was passed, the town leaders converged at the drugstore, as they always did back in the day, right?
Hey, well, they sold real Coca-Cola.
And they had a soda fountain there. Yeah. And so at any rate, the town leaders get together and say, you know what? Maybe we can revive our economy by drawing attention to Dayton, Tennessee, by hosting the trial. Let's find somebody who will be able to challenge the law. And they knew about, John Scopes, small town, everybody knows everybody. They send a kid over to the tennis court where Scopes is playing tennis with some of his students. and Mr. Robinson wants to see you. And they go down to Robinson's drugstore, and Scopes walks in, and the drama unfolds from there. And he said, well, yeah, I sort of think I remember teaching evolution to my students. Good enough. They call the newspapers, they call the prosecutor, he's promptly arrested. He volunteered to challenge the law. But thank God he did, because America, Trish, was at the precipice, staring at the abyss of, suffocating learning and science and, asphyxiating free speech in America in favor of censorship by the government. And, we face these same things today, don't you know? I mean,
Well,
we
for
are
sure.
seeing partisan censorship in political discourse, polarizing disinformation campaigns, classroom indoctrination, this punitive cancel culture under the guise of social justice, whereby conformity of thought supplants robust debate. And so I say to people, if you don't know your history, you're destined to repeat it. And, it seems like we're repeating it.
Oh, well, for sure. And in different ways, right? Because it never repeats identically. And in some ways, you could look at this and Scopes could, somebody out there who's teaching transgender identity. And by the way, let me just say, and I've said this to the listeners before, and they know this, and you and I are friends, so you certainly know this about me. I'm a very a very compassionate person, and I think we as a society need to be incredibly compassionate. And I'm a little bit libertarian, like you do your thing, I'll do mine. And yet, what has happened, right, is that it's now become this woke thought, which I remember back in, 2015, 2016, when you used to come on my show at 2 p.m. On Fox Business. One day, our producer, Jenna, was like, hey, let's do this story on people who identify as male, or forgive me, female, wanting to use the women's restrooms. And I'm like, but who? Like, it's 0.01% of the population. Like, who even, it's... Right. And it shocks me just how quickly, Greg, it's changed. And I remember, am I going to, if some guy looks like a girl and he's in the bathroom, I'm not going to love it, but is it going to become a federal case? Well, now we're at the position in society where it's like, if you don't just adhere, if you don't accept, if you don't allow your kids to question, the things that the schools want them to question in terms of their own identity, then somehow you're prejudiced. And so it's kind of I find this book to be so fascinating. It's such an interesting time because we've got the inverse of it going on right now, right?
Yeah, and I try to draw it all together in the epilogue, which is fairly long. But instead of evolutionary theory, the battlefront that has opened up is a different theory. It's called critical race theory. And the problem is that there's no universal agreement on what it is or what it means. There are disparate versions of it. Some are benign, some are not. And I cite...
By the way, that came out of law school theory too, if I'm correct.
Oh yeah, of course it did. But as I cite specific examples and court cases, it is being taught in, secondary education, public schools, and so forth. So it's not just colleges and universities. And
but wouldn't they say in that case, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but that's sort of the Scopes guy, right? Like the teacher that's teaching CRT would say, but wait a second, I need to be protected. I need to make sure that I can teach this. And so we, in believing in the First Amendment, say, okay, you can teach what you want to teach within maybe certain guidelines. But it's gotten to the point where it's totally backfired. And now it's no longer sort of, we're teaching this. It's like, you have to believe this. It's a total indoctrination of society.
Yeah. In some places, critical race theory simply means that you should accurately and honestly teach American history in a forthright way. And that includes the ugly stain of slavery and racism and segregation and Jim Crow laws and those who oppose civil rights for all. That needs to be honestly dealt with. Students need to learn that. But the polar extreme then is this indoctrination of which you were speaking, in which kids are being told everybody is in two groups based on the color of your skin, either oppressed or oppressor. And classrooms, especially with young people in them, are suddenly now venues of guilt and shame, which is fundamentally wrong. I think we can all agree on that. We should all agree on that. And so, I think Clarence Darrow, I tried to put myself in the shoes of Clarence Darrow. Darrow always sought common ground, just as he did in The Trial of the Century in my book. He tried to explain to people that evolution and creationism can live in harmony. That is, in fact, the position of Pope Francis, who built on his predecessor's analysis of evolution and creation. As Pope Francis says, evolution presupposes creationism. They are together in our world. And so, Darrow would want that kind of common ground. It's exactly the argument that he made in The Trial of the Century.
It's so interesting and so relevant and so poignant, and I commend you for helping us to remember our history, right? To better understand where we are today, because there is a view, and look, I got kids in school as well. There's sort of this idea that there is no God, right? When you're studying science, especially some versions of science like astrophysics, and I had to sit my kids down and be like, whoa, like, where are you going with this? And I think I'm just going to say, I think especially for young children, that kind of distance from religion and is not healthy, only because, and I say this, people can be whatever they want to be, but I say that because we need to kind of believe in something more and something bigger in life. But if you decide to teach something like, oh, this doesn't exist, or it's exactly this way, then isn't that the same as teaching evolution, right? Not evolution, teaching Adam and Eve and ignoring everything else. It's like we have to understand the complexity of the world, and I believe have an appreciation for all these different viewpoints, because nothing is black and white.
Yeah, Darrow said something very poignant in the trial as he's pleading to the judge to dismiss the case. He said, people should be allowed to exercise religion freely, just as people ought to be able to learn freely. And, let's not make the Bible the yardstick by which all science and other educational pursuits are measured. It shouldn't be subjected to a litmus test derived from the book of Genesis. And, that was a very powerful argument. Now, of course, today we know from the Supreme Court that this is a clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. Yeah. But what's so interesting is that wasn't binding on the states until 2 decades after the Scopes trial, the trial of the century. The Supreme Court took it on a piecemeal basis. They picked apart nearly every part of the Bill of Rights. And, these are federal rights, and it wasn't made binding by the 14th Amendment on the states in the case of the Establishment Clause until I think it was 1945. And I kept struggling as I'm reading the trial transcript, the original trial. I'm even reading the longhand court reporter notes in beautiful longhand.
Okay.
And I can't figure out why Darrow isn't making this obvious argument. And, it came to me in the middle of the night at about 3 a.m. one night. About 2 weeks later, I woke up in a start in that one of those aha moments. And I got up. I think I know the answer. And I pad through the living room to my office. I pull it up on the computer, and there it is. It wasn't until the mid-1940s that the Supreme Court made the Establishment Clause binding. So if Darrow had lived for 2 more decades, and tried the case then, it would have been dismissed at the outset, but not in 1925.
Let me ask you about the court today, because there's been a lot of talk. You've heard the political talk about, okay, we need to put more justices on, stacking the court as it's known. We seem to have lost faith as Americans in so many institutions, right? Whether it be the Oval Office, whether it be Congress, whether it be the Federal Reserve, whether it be the banking system. I mean, all these sort of institutions, whether it be educational systems as well. And the Supreme Court's part of that, which is kind of tragic, Greg, because, that was sort of the one place where everybody was still up on that pedestal. They've all been knocked off it. And, you think about where we're heading with that. What's your view as a lawyer, as someone who's a legal sort of historical scholar? I think I can call you that, given the tremendous research in this book. What's the danger, and where does it take us?
Well, I'm a big believer in the First Amendment and free speech, and people ought to be free to criticize anybody and everybody in government. That includes all three branches of government. Yes, we sort of intellectually put Supreme Court justices, those 9 people in robes, on a pedestal, but they're not above or below criticism, and where it's deserved, they ought to be able to tolerate it, and our Constitution tolerates it. I do think it's a silly argument to try to pack the court the way FDR tried to do. It doesn't like the decisions that are being rendered, so let's add more justices to change the complexion and political disposition of the court. That's an ugly pendulum that will then swing back and forth. The opposite party gains power, and they'll do the reverse. So, that's silly, and anybody who makes that argument, to me,
kind of banana
really
republic, that was a Hugo Chavez move. First thing he did was put all his buddies on the court. The danger is that it can't swing back at that point. That somehow other things start to happen. I just think it's tremendous. I'm seeing a movie here. I just got to say, I mean, as I hear you talk, the producer wheels are turning. Certainly a documentary, but I think it could be a massive blockbuster movie. Hope your agent's thinking about that.
Well, thank you so much. That would be interesting. There was a fictionalized version of the Scopes Monkey trial. It was a Broadway play, I think back in the 40s and 50s, called Inherit the Wind. It was made into a Hollywood movie, black and white, premiered in 1960. Honestly, it did not do well at the box office, notwithstanding, Spencer Tracy playing the fictionalized version of Clarence Darrow, Frederick March playing the novelized version of William Jennings Bryan. And
I think I saw this, actually.
H.L. Mencken, the famed journalist who was not a handsome man, was played by quite a handsome man, Gene Kelly, in the movie. But it didn't do all that well. And I found it so interesting once I read through over and over the original trial transcript. It's more interesting and fascinating.
Oh, I'm sure you could do a better job with it than those scriptwriters back then. Trumbo is a movie I recently saw again a couple months ago. I watched it, and it was fascinating to me because it's exactly it's kind of an inverse, right, on everything that was going on. Trumbo was the story of the film writer who couldn't get work in Hollywood because he was blacklisted during the McCarthy days, right, with McCarthyism in full swing. And you see how, if you fast forward to today, history is in fact repeating itself. It is a kind of McCarthyism, except just different players, different sides. And so much like what you're talking about with the trial of the century, again, they can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Gregg's website. The book just released today. Really, really fantastic story. And of course, Gregg is tremendous as a writer. You've had tons of bestsellers. I know that. So I encourage people to check it out. But it is so relevant, right? Just as Trumbo was. It's something that's happening over again.
Maybe Bryan Cranston, who played Trumbo, should play Clarence Darrow in the film version of the trial of the century. What do you think?
I like that idea. I think we
you're
should
well
put that out.
Trish. Get to work on that.
Okay, I'll see if I can get in touch with Brian. Anyway, listen, I so appreciate you coming on. I love that you wrote this, and everybody should go check it out. Trial of the Century by Gregg Jarrett, my friend. Very good to see you. Thank you for your time.
Bless you. It's great to see you. I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trish.
We'll talk soon.